I had a request to do a video about the economies of density, specifically the population density needed to support the basic amenities of life, such as a grocery store, a pharmacy, or a coffee shop, as well as medical offices. Well, not to worry, I've got you covered. As a permaculture urbanist, I've been thinking a lot about urban density and whether there's a sweet spot where the density is high enough for walkability and yet low enough to produce all of our food and energy in the urban environment. So in today's episode, I'll be using two popular tools to compare wildly different world cities. We'll be looking at the density needed for transit, clinics, schools, and food and energy security. Welcome to Edenicity, best practices for sustainably abundant cities. All right, just to make sure that we're on the same page, population density is the number of people per unit area. So if you draw a circle much bigger than this one, as we'll see in a moment, and use the census or other data to count the number of people within that circle, you can then start to compare the densities of one city to another. Now, this is an image from an area that I used to drive by all the time about a decade ago, and it was a very low density area. In areas like this, people are spread out, so it takes a long time for people to get anywhere, to places like jobs, stores, and school. So one of the things that struck me as I moved into a rural environment was the very obvious demand that people had for the conveniences of a higher density life. So on the side of this trailer, for example, they wrote, "Convenience store wanted," and that's been up there for at least 15 years, maybe longer. And if you look really closely, you'll notice that the people standing in front of the house in the background are actually stenciled onto the surface of the house, almost like decoys. When you're living low density, there's not that many people to move about, and so therefore you're not going to find many bus stops, and you kind of need a car if you can afford it. A family with multiple jobs and school and so forth might need several cars. So right away, we see that low density comes with significant costs, but the upside is that there's plenty of room to grow food and gather renewable energy. In other words, it's much easier to be self-sufficient. Now, the other end of the spectrum, of course, in a high-density area, there's lots of other people nearby. And if it's planned well, with mixed uses allowed, then this kind of environment will be very walkable. Work, school, shops, and friends are all just a short walk away. But in this environment, cars become a liability. It's hard to find parking, and it gets pretty expensive. So in most cases, you're better off walking or taking public transit. And of course, there isn't much room to grow all of your food or produce all of your renewable energy. Okay, now that we're on the same page, let's go to the first of those two tools that I promised. Full disclosure, I learned about this tool in a recent episode of City Nerd, one of my very favorite YouTube channels. I've linked it below in the description. And it just seemed like too much fun, so here we are. So the idea here is you can zoom in on any place. So here I am in the Hawaiian Islands, and it will tell you how many people there are in a circle of different sizes. So I chose a 3-kilometer wide circle, and I'll just drop one here in West Oahu, where there's about 66,000 people within this 3-kilometer radius circle. It's a little hard to read down in the bottom here, but it says that it contains 20 bus stops and 1 metro or train stop and 0 tram stops within this circle. Those are some numbers to compare. And at the end, I'll take you on a quick tour of a lot of cities, take those numbers and crunch them, and we'll see what they mean. Let's take a look at a little denser part of the island, 149,000 people, with 229 bus stops and no tram or metro lines at all. Then going east, we get back down to a lower density, about half as many people, quarter as many bus stops, again, no trams, no metros. It's a pretty cool tool. You can use this in most parts of the world. Sometimes it'll be a little bit slow to update, but it's a pretty cool tool. All right, the second of our tools is WalkScore, one of my very favorite sites. You just enter in the zip code, and it tells you what the walk score is. That is how walkable a place is on a scale of 1 to 100, 100 being the best. And if you dig around on the site, they explain how they calculate it. But basically, it all has to do with how far away all of life's basic amenities are, including things like grocery stores, clinics, schools, and so forth. All right, now that we have our tools, I've got enough information to crunch the numbers to get some idea what the transit situation is in different cities. So let's start with Manhattan in New York City, which has almost 500,000 people in that 3-kilometer radius circle with almost 500 transit stops when you combine the 422 bus stops with the 73 metros. Now, I did a little math, and based on those transit stops being evenly distributed in that circle, which, as you can see, is an unreasonable assumption, given that a lot of that circle is underwater. But it gets us in the ballpark, so here we go. When I calculate the average distance between the transit stops, I get 240 meters, give or take probably a lot, which works out to about a 3-minute walk from one transit stop to another. That's based on walking 76 meters a minute or 2.8 miles per hour, which is pretty average if you're not trying to get a lot of exercise. Now, I'm going to talk about the food and energy score later, but notice that Manhattan has a low food and energy score. And I will compute that score, show you how to do it later in the episode. But as you can see, going back to walk score, Manhattan is a walker's paradise with a walk score of 100. This is the gold standard. A rider's paradise with a transit score of 100. And it's very bikeable with a bike score of 88. So this is a really tough act to follow. Now, at the other extreme, there's Rolling Hills, California, which is basically in the south end of LA, with little parts of San Pedro and Rancho Palos Verdes. Now, this area has the distinction of having a walk score of 4 out of 100. It's totally car dependent. And they were very charitable with their bike score, which was a 1, by calling it somewhat bikeable. I would say that's not bikeable at all. With one measly bus stop in the whole neighborhood, you're looking at an average transit distance of about 5 kilometers and a 70-minute walk to transit. But there's a lot of room to grow all the food and produce all of the energy that you need in the area, times maybe as much as 5, so long as people are willing to rebuild those multi-million-dollar mansions. But this is not typical of LA. Here's the downtown area, and as you can see, with a respectable 190,000 people, there's an astonishing 897 transit stops. That means the average distance between stops is just 180 meters, which most people could walk in 2 minutes and 20 seconds. The walk score is 93, the transit score is 98, both of which are nearly ideal, and the bike score is 79. Not bad at all. But to me, the most amazing thing is that the food and energy score is 70%, meaning they could grow within that circle 70% of the food and produce 70% of the energy that they need day to day, if they build along the lines of Edenicity. And I'll briefly summarize what that means in a little bit. All right, jumping across the pond, let's look at another favorite urbanist city, Vienna, Austria, with a population of 500,000 in our circle, and again, 881 transit stops. Now, there's no walk score, unfortunately. That tool only exists for the US and Canada. But there's 479 bus stops, 351 tram stops, and 51 metro and train lines. So this is really transit paradise. I'm sure it would have a transit score of 100. And the only downside is that in this dense urban core, you would only be able to grow about 25% of your food and produce 25% of your energy on site. All right, let's have a look at Hong Kong, Special Administrative Region of China. And in this case, the circle has a very respectable 340,000 people with an amazing 1,035 transit stops, which works out to a spacing of about 165 meters and a walk of 2 minutes and 10 seconds. Now, according to Hawaii State Senator Stanley Chang, who is also chair of the Housing Committee, Hong Kong is one of the world's densest cities, and it also has the fewest cars per capita and the longest life expectancy. And to me, the most amazing thing is that it's 76% green space. So there is enough room, even within the circle pictured here, to meet 39% of our food and energy needs. Now, there are denser parts of Hong Kong. For example, in Kowloon, there's 1.4 million people, with again another 1,300 transit stops, 147-meter transit distance, couple-minute walk to transit, and as you would expect, a much lower food and energy score. But let's look at some of those green spaces that I was talking about. On the southeast of Hong Kong Island, there's an area with 32,000 people, just 123 transit stops, about a 6-minute walk between each one, and enough space to provide 4 times the food and energy that people use on site. Now, I hope this is making really clear how much urban density varies from point to point, even within regions that people think of as one city. And just to punctuate that, let's look at the new territories in Hong Kong. I know somebody who raised chickens in Hong Kong, and it was pretty easy to guess where he was. This circle in the new territories only has 2,000 people with 5 transit stops. So in this area, you would have to walk 2.4 kilometers to go from one transit stop to the next. And for most people, that would be a half-hour walk. And check out that food and energy score of 6,000%. In other words, that little circle could produce enough food to feed over 120,000 people. Now, that's just in theory. In practice, a lot of these are mountainous areas or watershed reserves. So it's not like you can go in and convert all of that to food and energy without serious ecological consequences. Now, if you want to use the population around a point tool, here's a handy lookup table to translate the number of transit stops into how much time it would take to walk between them. To my way of thinking, the breakpoint comes at about 200 transit stops within the circle, which works out to about a 5-minute walk between stops. Now, what about schools, shops, clinics, and other amenities? To understand those, let's take a little bit more abstract view of what's going on with a city. Here's the Edenicity land use concept. It's a very stylized concept that shows you how buildings are organized in blocks how blocks are organized in villages, and how villages are organized in towns and regions in cities. In this drawing, there's 4 regions that comprise the city, with the regional centers shown in that salmon color. And on this diagram, I've drawn the very same 3-kilometer circle that we saw with the population around a point tool, so that you can see that most of a town in Edenicity would live within that circle. All right, let's get into services and amenities, starting with medical professions. I pulled the data from the World Population Review, which has a very handy list of the number of doctors per 10,000 people in most of the countries of the world, and has a nice summary below. So what I've done is pull the data from several selected countries for the number of doctors, nurses, dentists, and pharmacists in each of the countries. And it gets to be pretty interesting. As you can see, Monaco tops the list with the most medical professionals across the board. Burkina Faso, a very interesting Sahel state in Africa, has very few doctors. Denmark has lots of nurses, but very, very few doctors. Cuba has lots of doctors, lots of nurses, an incredible number of dentists compared to the other countries, but no pharmacists. So it makes for a really interesting study. Now, when I'm considering the Edenicity Plan, which is a car-free upgrade strategy for cities, I've noted in many other episodes that you're looking at 90% less overall trauma and maybe as much as 70 or 80% less chronic disease. Because without cars, there are fewer crashes, we're much less sedentary, and there's much less pollution. So I could make the case for dramatically fewer doctors in an Edenicity scenario. But I figure that between beginning of life care, end of life care, and elective care of all varieties, especially in the area of longevity, we're probably going to have about the same amount of demand for doctors worldwide as we have today. So from here on, that's what I'm using, the averages from all of these countries. So plugging that back into Edenicity, here's how that looks on the ground. In the Edenicity land use concept, you've got a city of 5.4 million people with 900 villages of 6,000 people. And that's where, fairly arbitrarily, I'd put about 60% of the medical jobs. Now, if we did that, you'd end up with about 44 doctors per village, and that works out to about 10 contact hours per resident per year. Again, not evenly distributed, most of it at the beginning and end of life. So those are your local clinics. In the 36 towns that make up Edenicity, we would deploy about 25% of the medical jobs. That works out to 460 MDs, registered nurses, and pharmacists per hospital. And that works out to about 4 contact hours per year on average per resident. In the 4 regions of Edenicity, these would be large regional trauma centers, university hospitals, and the like, with something like 1,000 doctors on staff. And that works out to about 2 contact hours per year. And at the city level, the most specialized hospitals would account for about 5% of medical jobs with 3,300 doctors on staff. When you multiply the number of areas in the city by the doctors corresponding to that area, you get something like 66,000 medical professionals in a city of 5 million, which is exactly average internationally. What about dentists? Again, plugging in the averages from around the world, we end up with 2 dentists per village of 6,000, which works out to 32 minutes per resident per year. And we work our way down to the specialists in the city at 3 minutes per resident per year. Now, really good dental care is important, and I think we could easily double this, at least at the village level, and have even better health outcomes without breaking the bank. And bear in mind that Cuba has 3 times this number of dentists. So translating that to Edenicity, I would break this up into 4 clinics, each about a 4-minute walk from anywhere in the village. And then the hospitals would be distributed within the town, regional, and city centers, respectively. All right, let's look at schools. Now, the way I think about schools is I take our life expectancy, and I'm going to be very optimistic and say it's 100. Then I take the minimum number of students you'd want in a grade in a school. Let's say that's just 20. And then those 2 numbers multiplied together is the number of residents you need to fill that school. So a school with just 1 classroom per grade would require 2,000 residents. Edenicity villages are 6,000 residents, so we're looking at about 3 classrooms per grade per village. For a school of 6 grades, there would be some 360 students, which is a very respectable school size. And obviously, these numbers can be varied quite a bit. Now, what about food? In Edenicity, we have a garden-to-cafeteria lifestyle. And this gets to be fairly involved. Let me share a spreadsheet with you so you can see what it looks like. Basically, I just wanted to see whether a single block of 32 buildings around a courtyard would be enough to support a cafeteria. And the answer was yeah, definitely. The meal price is based on the wages, the overhead, and profit, which I've set to 0 because here we're assuming a co-op. The numbers certainly work for profit as well. And what I find is that a block is big enough to employ 11 restaurant staff and 11 farmers at an effective wage of $19 an hour, working 32 hours a week, 10 months out of the year with 2 months of paid time off. Yeah, kind of a worker's paradise. Now, there's nothing in Edenicity that guarantees that any of this will be the case. I'm just showing how good it can be, just plugging in these salaries and then propagating them back to the meals. So I'm assuming that people are getting 100% of their meals at this cafeteria at a food budget that's a little high, $120 a week, but well within the budget of any of the workers at these restaurants. And of course, they probably get some free meals per shift. So Edenicity's garden-to-café system is robust and would support the workers and would be affordable and convenient for residents. And of course, some people are going to want to cook for themselves. I envision fairly small kitchens in each apartment. And the thing that's really different in this situation is that in Edenicity, you get all your groceries prepackaged for you in the cafeteria. So you just take it up to your room and cook it if you like. There would basically be no grocery stores. But for the purpose of figuring out the density sweet spot of grocery stores, I dug around a bit and found this article by the Urban Land Institute that pointed out that according to the U.S. Census Bureau, there's an average of 8,800 residents per supermarket nationwide, and they think that that number could be much smaller. So for my models, I just plug the number 8,000 in, and we'll see how that shakes out. In fact, let's do it now. This is another lookup table for when you use that population around a point tool. And in this case, I've divided things up into several density bands. So at the lowest density, 25,000 people or so within that 3-kilometer circle, that works out to 880 people per square kilometer, which is the number you would find in a Wikipedia entry about the city, which works out to a minimum of a 10-minute walk to school, a minimum of a 20-minute walk to a grocery store. And as I'll show in a later video, it's much more than that through much of the US anyway. An 8-minute walk to the nearest clinic, and a food and energy score of 500%. Now in Edenicity, we're growing food on the rooftops of buildings, in the courtyard orchards, in the farm belts around the villages, and in the farm forests that surround each town. And in each of these cases, unlike today's farming where you're just growing one crop in an open field, we're growing in layers like a rainforest. So it's a very different style of food production, and it's proven to yield many times more than commercial agriculture while restoring the health of the soil. This is based on a system called permaculture, which has about 1 million practitioners worldwide, and it is not something that you can cherry pick. The forest belt interacts with the farm belts, and the arrangement of the buildings and blocks around the courtyards also is functional. And I've done quite a few episodes on those topics on this channel. All right, medium density, 100,000 people, 3,500 people per square kilometer. That's a 5-minute walk to school, a 10-minute walk to the store, a 4-minute walk to a clinic, and you're able to produce about 130% of your food and energy. Edenicity has about 130,000 people within that 3-kilometer circle, and of course that also includes the farm belts and growing areas. That works out to a density of 4,700. Again, you can compare that to a Wikipedia entry for your city. That's about a 4-minute walk to school, 9 minutes to the store, 3.5 minutes to the nearest clinic, and you're able to produce, by definition, 100% of your food and energy on site. And skipping on down to a very high density, you're looking at 500,000 people and up within a 3-kilometer radius, or a density of 18,000 people per square kilometer. That's a 2-minute walk to school, less than a 5-minute walk to the store, 2-minute walk to a clinic, and you are theoretically capable of producing up to 30% of your food and energy on site. So those are our starting points for using density to think about how and how much we can update for total sustainability. Okay, here's that episode I mentioned earlier. And if you want to download that Edenicity land use concept, have a look at the publications that are linked in the description below. And I'm thinking about doing an episode in the near future that really explores the many urban food deserts in the United States. Let me know in the comments if you're interested in that. And while you're there, if you see that subscribe button, be sure to tap it so you don't miss that episode. Thanks as always to the wonderful patrons for supporting this channel. Take care, stay green, see you next time.